Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. On Sunday at 00 hours, a negotiated ceasefire halting Ukraine's civil war comes into effect. Is this a major diplomatic breakthrough that all parties involved in can be proud of? Or is this ceasefire merely a lull for the Kiev government to regroup? And what about Washington's reaction? To Crosstalk Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Jonathan Steele in London. He's an international affairs commentator for The Guardian. Also in London, we have Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. And in Moscow, we cross to Jeffrey Taylor. He is a contributing editor at The Atlantic and author of 7 books, most recently, Topless Jihadis, Inside FemMen, the world's most provocative activist group. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Marcus in London, if I can go to you first. After 17 hours of negotiations in Minsk, we have Minsk 2.0. Is it a good deal or a lull, as I said in the introduction of the program? Go ahead.
Well, my opinion is that the agreement in Minsk is only a temporary peace for Ukraine. It's only a temporary truce for Ukraine. Peace and stability has not come to Ukraine in the long term. And why do I say that? Because the root of the conflict in Ukraine has not been addressed and remedied. And that root is the American government's goal of seeking to bring Ukraine into NATO in order to weaken Russia and isolate Russia on its western borders. So unless the American government abandons that goal, there will be a conflict at some point in the future in Ukraine. Be it 2 years' time, be it 5 years' time, be it 10 years' time, we will be back in this situation. And Russia will not countenance Ukraine being in NATO. And so if the Americans are insistent, as they are, on attempting to weaken Russia and Europe by bringing Ukraine into NATO, then what has been decided this week in Minsk, as I said just now, is merely just a temporary truce. And we can draw a parallel with Georgia. There was a war between Russia and Georgia in 2008 because the Americans are trying to bring Georgia into NATO. Now, despite a very, very bloody war between Russia and Georgia, a reasonable person would have thought that the American government would have abandoned its objective of trying to bring Georgia into NATO. Okay. But ever since 2008, the Americans are insistent on Georgia becoming a member of NATO.
You're asking for reasonable people here, and I'm afraid there are not very many of them. But I would say that there were quite a few in Minsk. I take my hat off to Hollande and to Chancellor Merkel. I think they really did go the extra mile. Jeffrey, if I go to you, Marcus kind of jumped ahead of my game plan here. The Americans weren't in the room. How important or unimportant is that when it comes to Minsk 2.0 and getting a ceasefire in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I'm glad that they'll at least stop fighting for a while, hopefully permanently. But the real problem is that, and that's been the problem that diplomats with long experience with the Soviet Union have raised since the early 90s when NATO began expanding. This began under the Clinton administration, so it's a bipartisan deal here. And in Bucharest in 2008, the NATO declaration rejected giving Ukraine and Georgia membership action plans, that is a pathway to membership, but the declaration says they will be members of NATO. So the real problem, yes, right now it's great that they've stopped fighting. We'll see whether they implement the accord as it's supposed to be implemented.
Okay.
But the real problem is that at root.
Okay, Jonathan, weigh in here, because I've taken a look at some of the details that have been released, and on paper, it doesn't look that bad. And I provocatively on Facebook said, what did the Donbass get out of it? I got a lot of mixed reactions there. But maybe, a summation of what we've heard already, at least maybe there'll be some kind of ceasefire. They'll stop killing people. Jonathan, weigh in here. What's the value of what we've just heard here?
Well, I think the value is quite hopeful. Over the next 48 hours, there will be an increase in fighting, I'm sure, because the rebels want to try and capture this town of Debaltseve, which is an important railway junction held at the moment by Ukrainian government troops. And they probably would like to get that before the Saturday midnight deadline. But hopefully there will be then a real ceasefire, and then those other issues will be addressed, the prison swaps, the pulling back of heavy weapons, and the creation of a demilitarized zone. I mean, I do agree with the other speakers that these are the first stages of what has to be a much more complicated and long drawn-out process. The second stage, of course, is the constitutional reform, reform the Ukrainian constitution and allow devolution, and I would hope to allow the non-alignment, or to enshrine the non-alignment of Ukraine as a part of its constitution, with international guarantees from the United Nations Security Council that the country is non-aligned and will not join any alliance, but will be protected.
Okay, Jonathan Steele just said the most sane, rational thing you could ever hope for this conflict in Ukraine. But Marcus, in London, do you see that happening? Because during the negotiations, it has been said that Poroshenko took a break and made a phone call. And a lot of people are saying that phone call went to Washington. I can't prove it, okay? But it seems likely to me. Go ahead, weigh in.
Let's be clear about something. Petro Poroshenko is a puppet. He's a puppet of Brussels, and in particular, he's a puppet of the United States. What we have to remember is that February 2014, a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown in a Western-instigated coup. And remember, the next day, the new authorities in Kiev were recognized by the Americans and the European Union. So ultimately, that's what the problem is. It is the Americans are insistent on Ukraine becoming a part of the West sphere of influence. And I'm not being pessimistic about the agreement in Minsk. Of course I welcome communication, and of course I welcome the fact that hopefully civilian lives in the Donbass are going to be spared. But I do think we need to understand the last 20 years and how America has poured, officially speaking, $5 billion into Ukraine, and how the Americans, they stepped over a red line, in my opinion, last year when they instigated that coup. Now they have a pro-Western leader in Kiev. They are not going to let their strong position in Ukraine go. And I think we can also see similar things happening in Moldova and also in Georgia. So I'm not pessimistic. I'm just being brutally realistic about the situation.
You know, Jeffrey, a lot of the things that are in the fine print of what has been released is not particularly new. Jonathan mentioned some of them: de-evolution, greater autonomy for Lugansk and Donetsk. These are not particularly new ideas. The type of demilitarization, we'll see if it plays out. But all of this was talked about last spring in Minsk I. Now, what makes this different than then?
I think the European countries, at least, feel they've looked into the abyss and they're already suffering from sanctions. So there's probably more incentive on the European side to pressure the American side to somehow come around to the position, and there's no sign yet that they're near it, that Putin and Obama, or whoever is the president by the time this issue is resolved, need to have a summit. And they need to formally, or the United States has to forcefully and loudly state that it won't try to induct Ukraine into NATO. It's impossible that Ukraine, as things stand, obviously would get in. But the way to diffuse the whole situation there and in Georgia and other places in the former Soviet Union is to just make it clear that that we are not aspiring to bring. We're not aspiring to bring Ukraine into NATO, and that's something that there's no sign of.
No sign of right now. Jonathan,
no.
Let me go to you, because let's look at parallel conversations. One conversation was in Minsk to try to diffuse this crisis. The other conversation all over American media was the Pentagon is going to send trainers to Ukraine next month. This is all in the same time frame. So it doesn't seem to me that Washington is at all interested in kind of a peaceful process going on in Ukraine. They're talking about arming and training, not about Merkel, not about Hollande, not about Minsk II. Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, but I think Obama is being more cautious, as he has been on many other issues like Iran and Syria. He seems to be surrounded by hawks, but he is the one dove left in Washington. But I agree with Jeffrey. I mean, the European Union leaders, particularly Merkel and Hollande, have taken some very important decisions. They've seen that there is no military solution. They've seen how Kiev army, with the so-called anti-terrorist operation, did in the beginning of January, try and seize a lot of ground. It didn't work. They realized that it will never work because Russia is able to give enough help to the separatists to keep them going and even to defeat the Ukrainian army in certain places. So they've looked into the abyss, as Jeffrey said. They've seen there's no military solution, and they've been willing to come out publicly, both of them, to say it is wrong to arm the Ukrainian army now with Western weapons. So that is the first break in the Western alliance. I hope it will now be extended to the extent that, again, as Jeffrey said, that the European leaders, Merkel and Hollande, will be willing to say, let us get rid of this NATO issue and support Ukrainian non-alignment. They've virtually said that, saying Ukraine will not become a member of NATO
why are you
in the
so
short term.
reasonable? Why are you so reasonable all the time? Because, Marcus, when the Americans want to negotiate in Ukraine, that means surrender of the Donbass, no Russian influence, no Russia's security interests are never taken into account. That's when they start negotiations, isn't it?
I think we should. I think we should be very cautious about paying too much credit to France and Germany in these negotiations. Yes, there are divisions between America and the European Union over Ukraine. We saw that last year in regard to the sanctions. But in the end, the Europeans went along with what America wanted and placed sanctions on there. In 2015, the Americans are seriously considering arming the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian paramilitaries, and the Europeans, it would appear, are against that. But when push comes to shove, the Europeans will go along with what the Americans want, because the European Union is a staunch strategic ally to America. So even though the Europeans were hesitant about sanctions in 2014, they went along with them. Even though they're hesitant about arming Ukraine at the moment, should the Americans make a decision to go ahead with it, the Europeans will go along with that. Privately, they might be unhappy,
right.
They might be very hesitant.
I have to jump in here.
They go along with it.
I have to jump in, gents. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the ending of Ukraine's civil war. Okay, I'd like to go to Jeffrey here in Moscow. Right before the break, you were trying to jump in. Please do now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I think a lot is going to change in Europe over the next couple of years with Greece and the euro, and quite possibly, especially in France, with Marine Le Pen of the Front National, the front runner, at least in polls at this point. Their elections are in 2017, but and she is pledging to take France out of the Eurozone, maybe even out of the EU, and wants a stronger relationship with Russia. So I think it would be extremely hard if she came to power that they would have any chance of getting the unanimous decision needed to get NATO membership through for any other former Soviet republic.
You know, Marcus, you know, it's very interesting what Jeff said there, because that would explain one thing, at least in my mind, is the rush that these neocons have in Washington, because their window of opportunity for bringing Ukraine in to NATO and forced regime change in Russia, which has always been their ultimate aim here. And they see, and I think Jeffrey's right, the dynamics in Europe is getting very fluid. Right now, they have this window under a very weak, clueless American president when it comes to foreign policy. And this is one of the reasons why they're forcing so hard. And that accounts for the coup as well. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yeah, certainly, because the Americans are very well aware that the Russia in 2015 is not the Russia of the 1990s. During the 1990s, when Russia was in political and economic meltdown, the Americans were able to do pretty much what they wanted to on the international scene, and they completely sidelined Russia. Hence a lot of the reasons why Russia is such a resurgent country on the international scene. But in regard to new governments coming to power in the European Union, once again, I would exercise caution. We saw Syriza in the run-up to the Greek election talking about really getting significant compromises from Berlin and from Paris. Well, now Syriza is in power. They see the reality of the situation. Once you're in the European Union, it's very difficult to get out. And if we take what happened in 2010 when the Conservative Party came to power, the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, had been an ardent opponent of the European Union. He had called for Britain to leave the European Union. He became Foreign Secretary, he entered the Foreign Office, and all of a sudden he became a passionate supporter of the European Union. So I would be very, very careful about saying if a new government comes to power in Paris or Berlin or London, then we could see serious changes in the European Union. It doesn't happen. Once you're in the European Union, it's extremely difficult to get out and to change it.
Okay, let me go to Jonathan here. Okay, you know, one of the things, the biggest difficulty in finding peace for Ukraine's civil war is getting all of the parties inside of Ukraine to talk to each other. Well, at Minsk, that didn't happen. Over 17 hours, you didn't have the rebels and you didn't have the Kiev government speaking to each other. There was a contact group that did that for them. Looking at some of the pictures, photographs, okay, and I don't want to make a big deal about it, but Poroshenko was not pleased. He wasn't pleased during the entire process. And going back to Kiev, he's got to face a lot of really hardcore, even very nasty people, probably with their arms folded and saying, "What the hell did you do?" Because on paper, he made a lot of concessions. Jonathan, what do you think?
Well, I think that is true, but I mean, none of these places are monoliths. He is outflanked on the right by the Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who's even more favoured by Washington than he is himself, and who's much more hawkish and is in favour of, conscription for everybody in Ukraine, including women, and beefing up the army and spending more, and of course wants arms from Washington. So, there are problems there. There are problems within the EU between the new states, so-called, the Baltic states and Poland, and Hollande and Merkel, who are much more cautious and realistic. In Washington, as we mentioned already, there are splits between Obama and the hawks in the Pentagon. So I think there may be splits in Moscow too, between Putin and some people who are even more nationalistic and want a tougher line against Kiev.
I think, Jonathan, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I think our audience has to realize that. In Russian, if you look at Russia's political spectrum, Putin remains very much a moderate political figure. It's not told much about that outside of Russia itself. So, Jeffrey, if I can go to you, another real big issue here that is not being talked about and wasn't mentioned during the negotiations is that Kiev's economy is crashing. It has literally 6 weeks of reserves left. Yes, the IMF has come in and said it will give more money under the very important condition that peace is being sought. The IMF is not going to fund Kiev's war against the East. So we have a crashing economy. How much is that weighing on making a decision to pull back?
I think it's weighing extremely heavily on the Ukrainian leadership's position. And money is short everywhere, especially in Europe. And there's really no way that they can survive. I'm not even sure if they have 6 weeks left. But I don't know of any country that hasn't defaulted that's gotten this close to the line before. Maybe Greece. But so this is definitely an incentive for. It really works to get everybody in line.
Okay, Marcus, but that doesn't seem to stop the people that want to. I don't understand the rational calculus of Washington. They keep talking about, there has to be a peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine, which they don't want to call a civil war, which of course it is, and the economy is crashing. But they give chump change, just change, pocket change, to the Ukrainian government and says, "Attaboy, attaboy, keep going." I mean, how do you square the circle here? You just simply can't.
Well, I think the Americans, their attitude is this. If there is an opportunity for them to gain a foothold in a strategically important part of the world, in this case Ukraine, they will invest money there. Now, I know there's a substantial amount of money not coming directly from America, but it's coming from the IMF. But I don't think we should underestimate that, because in 2014, there were numerous commentators saying that now that Ukraine has decisively turned westwards, that the Americans and the Europeans, they won't put a rescue package together because Ukraine is in a desolate position economically and is the most corrupt country in Europe. Yeah. But Here we are in 2015. They've put a significant package together. And why is that? Because they will invest money, even if their economies are suffering at the same time. They will invest money if they believe in the long term there will be a return. And for the West to invest money in Ukraine, they believe in the long term the return will be this: Ukraine in the European Union, Ukraine in NATO, and Russia isolated on its western borders.
Okay, but it's always very easy for these people to invest somebody else's money, and I mean the taxpayers' money. It never comes back, but point taken. Jonathan, let's change gears here. Something very important. You know, they're looking at some form of autonomy for Lugansk and Donetsk, okay, special regions, their language, what kind of trade ties they have. It's quite extensive, the first draft of it all. What I'm concerned about is that then Odessa will say, well, what about us? And Kharkov, and then you can look at Galicia, which have been very concerned about the behavior of the Kiev regime with mobilization and whatnot. What I'm getting at here is that if you look at decentralization, why wouldn't other regions of Ukraine say, well, what about us as well? What I'm worried about, the ultimate conclusion of that process is you'll see the entire state of Ukraine fall apart. It's not impossible under these economic conditions.
It's not impossible, but I mean, it's quite cleverly worded. I think it uses the phrase special status. That's a softer line than saying federalization, because then every part of Ukraine would have the right to much more control over its own destiny. So special status, I suppose, is meant to isolate this problem of Lugansk and Donetsk from the rest of the country, as you just mentioned, places like Odessa and Kharkiv and so on. So let's see how that works out. But of course, the devil is in the detail. It'll have to go through the Kiev Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, to work out exactly what the status is, what powers the new authorities in the local areas have, etc. And it could still stumble at that point in the discussions in parliament in Kiev.
Okay, Jeffrey, one could make the argument that Putin showed up. He's talking to the militias through intermediaries in eastern Ukraine. He conveyed their ideas in Minsk. He went the extra mile. So the Russian side is going to say, okay, what about the sanctions? Can we have a timetable here? Isn't it fair for the Russian side to say, what about us? What do we get out of this after what we've done? Go ahead.
Yes, it is. But I think you know the sanctions were voted into law and would have to be voted out of law in the United States.
In the United States. Right.
Yeah, and you know the kind of Senate and House of Representatives we have. It won't happen, well, in the next 2 years. So I'm sure Putin and his people understand that, but we're just about to have a presidential election in the United States, and this is going to be an issue. Who's going to be soft on Russia? Who's going to be firm with Russia? And it's going to make things more difficult.
Okay, and Marcus...
I do think they understand it, though.
Oh, I'm sure they understand it, okay? They're not very logical about it. And, you know, after all, Marcus, it's another continent. It's thousands of miles away. Why would they care about the fate of the Ukrainian people? If they can't own it, can't take it, who cares about it? And you know what? Russia has to pay for it because there's 1 million refugees over the side, on this side of the border. You know, it works out really well. It's very cynical, isn't it?
And that's not something you hear about in Western press, and it's certainly not something you hear about in the mainstream media in Britain, about the thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian males who refuse to be called up to serve in the Ukrainian army, to go and fight in Donbass, and now they've gone into Russia. Why have they chosen to go into Russia? If we take the British mainstream press, they've been, for the last year and a half, they've been depicting Russia as an alien country, as an alien culture in Ukraine, which is absolutely preposterous nonsense. But nonetheless, they've completely distorted the reality of the history between Russia and Ukraine. And quite frankly, prior to the conflict in Ukraine, most British journalists wouldn't have been able to find Ukraine on the map. They don't understand that prior to 1991, Ukraine had never existed in any form whatsoever. So it's no surprise how Ukraine has been depicted by the mainstream press in the West. And of course, we've seen it in Syria. We saw it in the former Yugoslavia as well. It's a very sad reminder
well,
of
it's
how
a very sad
Western
reminder.
media is a formidable tool of Western governments.
When there's Western wars against other peoples, that's when Americans learn their geography, unfortunately. Many thanks to my guests in London and here in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk this.
I love you.